When one goes to a restaurant and feels hungry, but the food does not come, one can repeat the order to the boy. If the boy is rude, one can complain to the management and do something about it. But if the boy replies in the most elegant manner, coming, coming, and does not move a step, one can do absolutely nothing except pray or curse in the most elegant manner also. Such, in brief, is the passive strength of the Chinese people, a strength which those who are made to feel most will appreciate best. It is the strength of the old rogue. So far, we have been dealing with three of the worst characteristics that paralyze the Chinese people for organized action. These characteristics are seen to spring from a general view of life, as shrewd as it is mellow, distinguished by a certain tolerant nonchalance. It is evident that such a view of life is not without its virtues, and they are the virtues of an old people, not ambitious nor keen to sit on top of the world, but a people whose eyes have seen much of life, who are prepared to accept life for what it is worth, but who insist nevertheless that this life shall be lived decently and happily within one's lot. For the Chinese are a hard-boiled lot. There is no nonsense about them. They do not live in order to die, as the Christians pretend to do, nor do they seek for a utopia on earth, as many seers of the West do. They just want to order this life on earth, which they know to be full of pain and sorrow, so that they may work peaceably, endure nobly, and live happily. Of the noble virtues of the West, of nobility, ambition, zeal for reform, public spirit, sense for adventure, and heroic courage, the Chinese are devoid. They cannot be interested in climbing Mont Blanc or in exploring the North Pole, but they are tremendously interested in this commonplace world, and they have an indomitable patience, an indefatigable industry, a sense of duty, a level-headed common sense, cheerfulness, humor, tolerance, pacifism, and that unequaled genius for finding happiness in hard environments, which we call contentment. Qualities that make this commonplace life enjoyable to them. And chief of these are pacifism and tolerance, which are the mark of a mellow culture, and which seem to be lacking in modern Europe. Indeed, it seems at times, on watching the spectacle of present-day Europe, that she is suffering less from a lack of smartness or intellectual brilliance than from the lack of a little mellow wisdom. It seems at times barely possible that Europe will outgrow its hot-headed youthfulness and its intellectual brilliance, and that after another century of scientific progress, the world will be brought so closely together that the Europeans will learn to take a more tolerant view of life and of each other, at the risk of total annihilation. They will perhaps learn to be a little less brilliant and a little more mature. I have confidence that the change of view will be brought about not by brilliant theories, but by an instinct for self-preservation. Perhaps then the West will learn to believe less in self-assertion and more in tolerance. For tolerance will be direly needed when the world is closely knit together. They will be a little less desirous to make progress and a little more anxious to understand life. And the voice of the old man of Han Kukuan Pass will be listened to more widely. From the Chinese point of view, pacifism is not noble. It is simply good because it is common sense. If this earthly life is all the life we can have, we must try to live in peace if we want to live happily. From this point of view, the self-assertion and the restlessness of the spirit of the West are signs of its youthful rawness. The Chinese, steeped in his Oriental philosophy, can see that that rawness will gradually wear off at Europe's coming of age. For strange as it may seem, out of the extremely shrewd philosophy of Taoism, there always emerges the word tolerance. Tolerance has been, I think, the greatest quality of Chinese culture, and tolerance will also become the greatest quality of modern culture when that culture matures. To learn tolerance, one needs a little sorrow and a little cynicism of the Taoist type. True cynics are often the kindest people, for they see the hollowness of life, and from the realization of that hollowness is generated a kind of cosmic pity. Pacifism, too, is a matter of high human understanding. If man could learn to be a little more cynical, he would also be less inclined toward warfare. That is perhaps why all intelligent men are cowards. The Chinese are the world's worst fighters because they are an intelligent race, backed and nurtured by Taoist cynicism and the Confucian emphasis on harmony as the ideal of life. They do not fight because they are the most calculating and self-interested of peoples. An average Chinese child knows what the European gray-haired statesmen do not know, that by fighting one gets killed or maimed, whether it be an individual or a nation. Chinese parties to a dispute are the easiest to bring to their senses. That calculating philosophy teaches them to be slow to quarrel and quick to patch up. That mellow, old roguish philosophy which teaches the Chinese patience and passive resistance in times of trouble also warns them against momentary pride and assertion at the moment of success. The Chinese Council for Moderation says, "When fortune comes, do not enjoy all of it. When advantage comes, do not take all of it." To be over-assertive and to take full advantage of one's position is called showing too much edge, a mark of vulgarity and an omen of downfall. Whereas the English believe in not striking a man when he is down, out of respect for fair play, the Chinese equivalent expression, "do not push a fellow to the wall," is merely a matter of culture, or hanyang, as we call it. To the Chinese, the Versailles Treaty is not only unfair, it is merely vulgar or lacking in hanyang. If the Frenchman had been imbued a little with the spirit of Taoism at the moment of his victory, he would not have imposed the Versailles Treaty, and his victory and his head would rest more easily on its pillow today. But France was young, and Germany would certainly have done the same thing, and no one realizes the extreme silliness of two nations like France and Germany, each trying to keep the other permanently under its iron heels. But Clemenceau had not read Lao Tzu, nor has Hitler, so let them fight while the Taoist watches and smiles. Chinese pacifism is also largely a matter of temperament as well as of human understanding. Chinese boys fight much less in the street than Western boys. As a people, we fight much less than we ought to, in spite of our interminable civil wars. Put the American people under the same misrule, and there would have been 30 revolutions, not 3, in the last 20 years. Ireland is at peace because the Irish fought hard, and we are still fighting today because we do not fight hard enough. Nor are Chinese civil wars fighting in the real sense of the word. Until recently, civil wars were never glorified. Conscription for service is unknown, and the soldiers who do the fighting are poor people who do not know how to make a living otherwise. These soldiers do not relish a good fight, and the generals relish the fight because they do not do the fighting. In any measured campaign, silver bullets have always won, in spite of the fact that the conquering hero may make a majestic, triumphal return to the capital to the accompaniment of the boom of guns. Those guns, they suggest so much the sound of battle, and they are typical for in Chinese private quarrels and civil warfare. It is the sound and noise that make up the essence of the battle. One does not see fighting in China, one merely hears it. I heard 2 such battles, one in Peking and one in Amoy. Orally, it was satisfying. Usually, a superior army merely awes the inferior enemy into defeat, and what would be a protracted campaign in a Western country is finished in a month. The defeated general, according to the Chinese idea of fair play, is then given $100,000 traveling expenses and sent on a tour of industrial investigation to Europe. with the full knowledge that in the next war his services may be needed by the present conqueror. With the next turn of events, the most probable thing is that you will find the victor and the vanquished riding in the same car like two sworn brothers. That is the beauty of Chinese Hanyang. Meanwhile, the people have nothing to do with it. They hate war and will always hate war. Good people never fight in China. For good iron is not made into nails, and good men are not made soldiers. Contentment. Travelers in China, especially those wayward travelers who go through the seldom visited parts of the Chinese inland, are equally amazed at the low standard of living of the Chinese toiling masses and at their cheerfulness and contentment under such conditions. Even in the famine-stricken provinces like Shenxi, the spirit of contentment generally prevails in all except extreme cases, and some Shenxi farmers probably can still smile even now. Now, a lot of the so-called misery of the Chinese people is due undoubtedly to the application of a warped European standard, a standard which cannot conceive of any man being happy unless he is living in an overheated apartment and owns a radio. If this standard were correct, there should have been no happy person in the world before 1850, and there should be more happy people in the United States than in Gmutlicks, Bavaria, where there are very few rotating, adjustable, collapsible, and reversible barber chairs, and certainly very few switches and buttons. There are still fewer switches and buttons in the Chinese countryside, although in progressive Shanghai, the old-fashioned barber chair that is a real chair, and that one can still find on Kingsway in London or in Montmartre in Paris today, has completely disappeared. For myself, I am inclined to think that the man who sits on a chair that is a real chair and sleeps on a bed that is a real bed and not a daytime sofa is a happier man. The standard that measures a man's civilization by the number of mechanical buttons he presses in a day must therefore be a false standard, and a lot of this so-called mystery of Chinese contentment is of the Westerner's own making. It is true, however, that Chinese people are perhaps more contented than Western people, class for class, when living under the same conditions. The spirit of cheerfulness and contentment is found in both the literate and illiterate classes, for such is the penetration of the Chinese racial tradition. It may be seen in the gay, babbling rickshaw boy of Peking, forever laughing and joking all the way and ready to laugh at a fellow man's discomforts, or may be seen in the panting, perspiring sedan chair coolies who carry you up to the top of Kuling, or it may be seen in the boat trackers who pull your boat up Sichuan Rapids, and who earn for their living a bare pittance beyond 2 simple but hearty meals a day. A simple but hearty meal eaten without much worry is, however, a great deal of luck, according to the Chinese theory of contentment. For as a Chinese scholar has put it, a well-filled stomach is indeed a great thing, all else is luxury in life. For contentment is another of those words like kindliness and peaceableness, which are written on red paper and pasted on all doors on New Year's Day. It is a part of the counsel for moderation, part of that human wisdom which says, when good fortune comes, do not enjoy all of it, and of that advice of a meaning scholar, to choose the lighter happiness. Among the epigrams of Lao Tzu which have passed into current phraseology is the maxim that one who is contented will not meet with disgrace. Another form of this maxim is, one who is contented is always happy. In literature, it emerges as a praise of the rural life and of the man who has few worries, a sentiment which is found in all poems and private letters. I pick at random from a collection of letters of meaning scholars. Thus wrote Lu Shen to his friend. Tonight we are going to have a full moon. How about getting a painted houseboat and bringing along a few musicians? Can you come and spend the night with me in this early autumn? I am going to have a recluse's gown made, and when my resignation is accepted, I shall be indeed a carefree old man of the mountains. It is this sort of sentiment which, when passing into the current thoughts and feelings of the Chinese scholar, enables him to find happiness in his lowly hut. Human happiness is a frail thing, for the gods are evidently jealous of it. The problem of happiness is therefore the most elusive problem of life. But after all is said and done about culture and progress, it should remain the primary concern of mankind's highest wisdom to solve it. The Chinese, with their usual common sense, have bent their highest efforts towards the finding of this happiness, and like the utilitarians that they are, have always been more interested in the problem of happiness than in the problem of progress. Mrs. Bertrand Russell wisely pointed out that the right to be happy was and still is a forgotten right that nobody in the West is interested in. Westerners are preoccupied with the more secondary rights to vote, to pass upon the king's expenditure, to declare war, and to be tried when arrested. The Chinese have never even thought of the right to be tried when arrested, but they have always been supremely jealous of the right to happiness, which neither poverty nor disgrace is allowed to take away from them. The Western approach to the problem of happiness is positive, while the Chinese approach, like the Diogenesian approach, is negative. The question of happiness is always reduced, in the last analysis, to the question of a man's wants. The fact is, we are very much in confusion as to what we really want. For this reason, the story of Diogenes, who proclaimed to the world that he was a happy man because he did not want anything, and who threw away his bowl on seeing a boy drinking from his hands, always provokes some laughter and a certain amount of real envy from the modern man. The modern man finds himself in continual perplexity in regard to many problems, and most of all in problems that affect closely his personal life. He cannot spare himself a certain luxurious envy for that ascetic ideal of Diogenes, and is at the same time far from willing to miss a really good show or movie. That gives us the so-called restlessness of the modern spirit. The Chinese, without going so far as Diogenes, for the Chinese never go far in anything, take the negative approach to happiness through their philosophy of contentment. Unlike Diogenes, however, a Chinese man wants quite a few things, but he wants only the things that make for happiness, and at the same time does not insist on having them if they are out of his reach. He wants at least a pair of clean shirts, for Diogenes in a storybook may excel a certain spiritual fragrance, but Diogenes as a bedfellow would be a different story. But if he is extremely poor and can have only one shirt, he will not mind either. And unlike Diogenes, he wants also a good show, and he would give himself up to the full enjoyment of it. But if he must go without that, he will not be too sorry. He wants some tall old trees in his neighborhood, but if he cannot have them, the date tree in his yard will give him just as much happiness. He wants many children and a wife who personally prepares his favorite dishes, and if he is wealthy, then a good cook, too, and a pretty maidservant in red pajamas to tend the incense while he is reading or painting. He wants some good friends with a woman who understands, preferably to be found in the person of his wife. If not, then in one of the sing-song girls. If he is not born with such voluptuous luck, then he will not be sorry either. He wants a filled stomach, but congee and pickled carrots are not so costly in China. And he wants a good jug of wine, but rice wine is often home brewed, or he can pay only a few cash for a bowl at the good old wine shops. He wants leisure, and leisure he can have in China, and he is as happy as a bird if he has met a monk in a bamboo-covered yard and enjoyed another of life's leisurely half-days. He wants a secluded hut if he cannot have an entire pleasure garden situated among the mountains with a mountain rill running past his hut, or in a valley where of an afternoon he can saunter along the river bank and watch cormorants catching fish for the fisher. But if he cannot have that luck and must live in the city, he will not be sorry either. For he would have, in any case, a caged bird and a few potted flowers and the moon, for he can always have the moon. So did Su Tongpo, the poet, write about the moon in a perfect gem-like little essay called A Night Promenade at Chongtian. On the fifth night of the 10th moon of the 6th year of Yuanfang, I had undressed and was going to bed when the moonlight entered my door, and I got up, happy of heart. I thought there was no one to share this happiness with me, so I walked over to the Changtian temple to look for Hua Min. He, too, had not yet gone to bed, so we paced about in the yard. The yard looked like a transparent pool with the shadows of water grass in it, but they were really the shadows of bamboos and pine trees cast by the moonlight. Isn't there a moon on every night? And aren't there bamboos and pine trees everywhere? Only there are a few carefree people like the two of us. A strong determination to get the best out of life, a keen desire to enjoy what one has, and no regrets if one fails. This is the secret of the Chinese genius for contentment. Humor. Humor is a state of mind. More than that, it is a point of view, a way of looking at life. The flower of humor blooms whenever, in the course of development of a nation, there is an exuberance of intellect able to flay its own ideals, for humor is nothing but intellect slashing at itself. In any period of history when mankind was able to preserve its own futility, its own smallness, and its own follies and inconsistencies, a humorist appeared, like Zhuangzi of China, Omar Khayyam of Persia, and Aristophanes of Greece. Athens would be infinitely poorer had there been no Aristophanes, and the Chinese intellectual heritage would be infinitely less rich had there been no Zhuangzi. Since Zhuangzi lived and wrote, however, all Chinese politicians and bandits have become great humorists, because they have been imbued directly or indirectly with the Zhuangzian view of life. Lao Tzu had laughed before him, a thin, shrill, yet cataclysmic laughter. He must have been a bachelor all his life, or he could not have laughed so roguishly. Anyway, there is no record that he ever married or had any progeny. The last coughs of Lao Tzu's laughter were caught up by Zhuangzi, and he, being a younger man, had a richer voice, and the ring of his laughter has reverberated throughout the ages. We still cannot resist a chance to laugh. Yet sometimes I feel we are carrying the joke too far, and laugh a little out of season. The abysmal ignorance of the foreigner about China and the Chinese cannot be more impressive than when he asks the question, do the Chinese have a sense of humor? It is really as surprising as if an Arab caravan were to ask, are there sands in the Sahara Desert? It is strange, however, how little a person may see in a country. Theoretically, at least, the Chinese people should have humor, for humor is born of realism, and the Chinese are an unusually realistic people. Humor is born of common sense, and the Chinese have an overdose of common sense. Humor, especially Asiatic humor, is the product of contentment and leisure, and the Chinese have contentment and leisure to a supreme degree. A humorist is often a defeatist, and delights in recounting his own failures and embarrassments. The Chinese are often sane, cool-minded defeatists. Humor often takes a tolerant view of vice and evil, and instead of condemning them, laughs at them, and the Chinese have always been characterized by the capacity to tolerate evil. Toleration has, then, a good and a bad side, and the Chinese have both of them. If the characteristics of the Chinese race we have discussed above, common sense, toleration, contentment, and old roguery, are true, then humor is inevitable in China. Chinese humor, however, is more in deeds than in words. The Chinese have their words for the various types of humor, but the commonest type, called huachi, in which sometimes the Confucian scholars indulge their pseudonyms, really means to me only trying to be funny. Such writings are only literary relaxations of a too rigoristic classical tradition, but humor as such had no proper place in literature. At least there was no open acknowledgement of the role and value of humor in literature. Humor indeed abounds in Chinese novels, but novels were never accepted as literature by the classicists. There is a very first-class humor in Shijing, book of poetry. in the Confucian Analects and in Han Feizi. But the Confucian gentleman, brought up in his Puritan view of life, could not see any fun in Confucius, just as he failed to see the wonderful tender love lyrics in Shijing, giving them fantastic interpretations as the Western theologians give the Song of Songs. There is very fine humor in Dao Yuanming's writings too, a sort of quiet, leisurely content and a refined luxury of self-abnegation, the best example of which is his poem on his unworthy sons. My temples are gray, my muscles no longer full. 5 sons have I, and none of them like school. Ah Shu is 16 and as lazy as can be. Ah Xuan is 15 and no taste for reading has he. 13 are Yong and Tuan, yet they can't tell 6 from 7. Ah Tong wants only pears and chestnuts. In 2 years he'll be 11. Then come, let me empty this cup, if such be the will of heaven. Humor there is too in Tu Fu's and Li Po's poetry. Tu Fu, who often produces in his readers a bitter smile, and Li Po, who pleases by his romanticist nonchalance, but we do not call it humor. The unholy awe in which Confucianism was held as a national religion also restricted the free expression of ideas and made the presentation of novel points of view and ideas taboo, and humor only lives on novel and original points of view. It is clear that such a conventional environment is not conducive to the production of humorous literature. If anyone were to make a collection of Chinese humor, he would have to cull it from the folk songs of the Yuan dramas and the Ming novels, all outside the pale of the classical literature. And in the private notes and letters of scholars, especially those of the Song and Ming dynasties, when they are a little off their guard. But the Chinese have nevertheless a humor all their own, for they always love a good joke. It is humor of a grimmer sort, and is based on the farcical view of life. In spite of the extremely serious style in their editorial and political writings, which are the extremely light manner, which are seldom relieved by humor, they often surprise the foreigners by the extremely light manner in which they take important reform programs and movements, like the Kuomintang agrarian program, the Sanmin doctrine, the flood and famine relief, the New Life movement, and the anti-opium bureaus. An American professor recently visiting Shanghai and lecturing in the Chinese colleges was completely surprised by the burst of laughter among the student audience whenever he made a perfectly sincere reference to the New Life movement. If he had made a serious reference to the anti-opium bureaus, he would have been met by still louder volleys of silvery laughter. For humor is, as I have said, a point of view, a way of looking at life. With that view of life we are more or less familiar. Life is a huge farce, and we human beings are mere puppets in it. The man who takes life too seriously, who obeys library reading room rules too honestly, who actually keeps off the lawn because merely a signboard says so, always makes a fool of himself and is usually subjected to laughter from his older colleagues. And since laughter is contagious, very soon he becomes a humorist too. This humorous farcicality then results in the inability of the Chinese to take anything seriously, from the most serious political reform movement to a dog's funeral. The farcical element in Chinese funerals is typical. In the grandiloquent funeral processions of Chinese upper and middle classes, you can see street urchins with dirty faces wearing embroidered and multicolored robes, accompanied in modern China by brass bands playing Onward Christian Soldiers, which facts are often adduced by Europeans as proofs of the Chinese lack of humor. A Chinese funeral procession, however, is a perfect symbol of Chinese humor, for Europeans alone take a funeral procession seriously and try to make it solemn. A solemn funeral is inconceivable to the Chinese mind. Where the Europeans err is that, with their preconceived notions, they think a priori that a funeral should be a solemn affair. A funeral, like a wedding, should be noisy and should be expensive, but there is no reason why it should be solemn. Solemnity is already provided for in the grandiloquent gowns, and the rest is form. And form is farce. To this day, I cannot distinguish between a funeral and a wedding procession until I see a coffin or a wedding chair. Chinese humor, then, as symbolized by the highly farcical funeral procession, consists in compliance with outward form as such, and a total disregard of the substance in actuality. One who appreciates the humor of a Chinese funeral should be able to read and interpret Chinese political programs properly also. Political programs and official statements are issued as matters of form, being drafted by clerks who specialize in a kind of specious, bombastic phraseology, just as there are special shops keeping funeral procession gowns and paraphernalia for hire, and no intelligent Chinese ever takes them seriously. A foreign newspaper correspondent should bear the symbol of the funeral gown in mind, they would be less likely to be misled by them, and then later give up the Chinese as a unique people that they fail to understand. This farcical view of life and this formula regarding form and substance can be illustrated in a myriad different ways. Some years ago, a government order originating in a request from the central Kuomintang prohibited the Chinese government ministries from keeping Shanghai offices in the foreign concessions. The actual carrying out of this order would mean a great inconvenience to the ministers who have their homes in Shanghai, and throw a number of people out of jobs. The Nanjing ministers neither defied the Nanjing order nor petitioned for its repeal on honest grounds of inconvenience and impracticability. No professional clerk could be clever enough to draft any such petition and make it accord with good form, since it meant the desire of Chinese officials to reside in foreign settlements, which would be unpatriotic. They did an infinitely cleverer thing by changing the door plates of their Shanghai offices and calling them trade inspection bureaus. The door plates probably cost $20 apiece. No man was thrown out of a job, and no face was lost. The school trick pleased not only the Nanjing ministers, but also Nanjing itself, where the original order was issued. Our Nanjing ministers are great humorists. So are our bandits. So are our warlords. The humor of Chinese civil wars has already been pointed out. In contrast with this, we might take the case of mission schools as showing the Western lack of humor. The missions were put into a scare a few years ago when the registration was required, which involved the crossing out of religious instruction from the school curricula, the hanging of Sun Yat-sen's picture in the assembly hall, and the holding of Monday memorial meetings. The Chinese authorities could not see why the mission schools could not comply with these simple regulations, while the missionaries could not see their way clear to accepting them. And there was a deadlock. Some missionaries actually had visions of closing up their schools, and in one instance everything would have gone on smoothly except for the stupid honesty of the Western principal who refused to cancel one sentence from their school catalog avowing religious instruction to be one of their aims. The principal wanted to be able to say honestly and openly that religious instruction was indeed the principal aim of their institution, and to this day that school is not registered. There was absolutely no lightness of touch. What this mission school should have done was to imitate the example of the Nanjing ministers, comply with every official regulation, hang a picture of Sun Yat-sen, and proceed a la Chinois as regards the rest. But I cannot help thinking that a school run with such stupid honesty must be an honest to goodness school. Such is the Chinese farcical view of life. The Chinese language abounds in metaphors regarding the drama of human life. Chinese officials assuming and leaving their posts are spoken of as entering the stage and making their exit, and a man coming with a high-sounding program is referred to as singing high opera. We really look upon life as a stage, and the kind of theatrical show we like best is always high comedy. Whether that comedy be a new constitution, or a Bill of Rights, or an anti-opium bureau, or a disbandment conference, we always enjoy it, but I wish our people would sometimes be serious. Humor above everything else is ruining China. One can have too much of that silvery laughter, for it is again the laughter of the old rogue, at the touch of whose breath every flower of enthusiasm and idealism must wither and die. Conservatism. No portrait of a Chinese character would be complete without a mention of its conservatism. Conservatism in itself should not be a word of reproach. Conservatism is but a form of pride and rests on a feeling of satisfaction with the present. Since there is usually so little one can be proud of and so little satisfaction in the arrangement of human life in this world, conservatism is really a sign of inward richness, a gift rather to be envied. The Chinese are by nature a proud race, excusably so, when one considers the whole course of their history except the last 100 years. For though politically they were at times humiliated, culturally they were the center of a vast humanist civilization that was conscious of itself and lacked no well-reasoned apologetics. China's only cultural rival of any importance that represented a different point of view was Indian Buddhism, and for Buddhism, the true Confucianists had always some measure of sneering contempt. For the Confucianist was immeasurably proud of Confucius, and being proud of Confucius, he was proud of the nation, proud of the Chinese having understood life in its moral essence, proud of their knowledge of human nature, and proud of their having solved the problems of life in all its ethical and political relationships. In a way, he was justified, for Confucianism not only asked about the meaning of life, but also answered it in a way that left people satisfied with having found the meaning of human existence. The answer was solid, clear, and sensible, so that it left people with no desire to speculate about the future life or to change the present one. Man naturally becomes conservative when he realizes he has got something that works and therefore something that is true. The Confucianists saw no other way of life, thought no other way possible. The fact that Westerners too have a well-organized social life and that a London policeman would help an old woman across the street without any knowledge of the Confucian doctrine of respect for old age comes to the Chinese always more or less as a shock. When the realization came that Westerners possess all the Confucian virtues of courtesy, orderliness, honor, kindliness, courage, and honesty of government, and that Confucius would have personally approved of the London policeman and tube conductor, that racial pride was badly shaken. There were things that displeased the Chinese and struck him as raw, uncouth, and barbarian, like husband and wife walking hand in hand together, father and daughter kissing each other, kissing on the screen, kissing on the stage, kissing on the railway platform, and kissing everywhere. These things confirmed him in the belief that the Chinese civilization was really superior. But there were other things, like the common people being able to read, women being able to write letters, general cleanliness, which he imagined was a heritage from the Middle Ages, instead of a 19th century invention. Students' respect for teachers, and English boys always saying "yes, sir" to their superiors and the like, which were immeasurably impressive. These, together with good roads, the railway, the steamship, good leather boots, Parisian perfume, the wonderfully sweet white children, the X-ray pictures, the camera, the phonograph, the telephone, and many similar things, have completely shattered the native pride. Helped by the extraterritorial rights and the generous use of European boots against Chinese coolies, for which there is no legal redress, the loss of pride became an instinctive fear of the foreigner. The old celestial pride is now no more. The hullabaloo raised by foreign merchants against possible Chinese attacks on the settlements is only a negative testimony of their courage and of their knowledge of modern China. Some inward indignation against those European boots and their liberal use against Chinese coolies there must always be. But if the foreigner thinks that the Chinese will ever show their indignation by reprisal with inferior leather boots, he is grossly mistaken. If they did, they would not be Chinese, but Christians. Practically speaking, admiration for the Europeans and fear of their aggressiveness are now universal. Some such bad shock must have been responsible for the ultra radicalism that brought about the Republic of China. No one could think China would become a republic. It was a change so vast and gigantic that it could appeal to none except the idiotic or the inspired. It was like building a bridge of rainbow across to heaven and then walking on it. But the Chinese revolutionists of 1911 were inspired. Following upon the Chinese defeat in the Sino-Japanese War of 1895, there was an active propaganda for modernization of China. There were two schools: the constitutionalists, who stood for a modernized, limited monarchy, and the revolutionists, who were for a republic. The left wing was led by Sun Yat-sen, while the right wing was led by Kang Youwei and his disciple Yang Shisha, who later forsook his master and turned left. For a long time, the adherents of these parties were fighting literary battles in Japan, but the question was finally settled, not by any argument, but by the apparent hopelessness of the Manchu regime and by the intrinsic appeal to racial pride. The political radicalism of 1911 was followed by the literary radicalism of 1916, when the Chinese Renaissance movement was started by Hu Shi and succeeded by the ideological radicalism of 1926, with the result that communism is today coloring the thought of practically all primary school teachers of the country. The consequence is that today China is divided into two armed camps of communism and reaction. There's a deep chasm separating the younger generation from the older generation, which is an extremely regrettable state of affairs. While the thinking younger generation are decidedly for a cataclysmic upheaval of the whole ideological and political system, a movement of conservative reaction has set in among the ruling authorities. The conservative reaction is unfortunately unconvincing, owing to the fact that its champions are mostly warlords and politicians whose personal lives are far from being models of Confucian conduct. Actually, such conservatism is only a cloak of hypocrisy and a sadistic reprisal giving outlet to their hatred of the young. For Confucianism teaches respect for old age and authority. The shining political light who utters large mouthfuls of Confucianism happens also to initiate Tibetan Lama Buddhist prayers for divine succor against Japanese aggression. The jumble of Confucian platitudes mixed with Sanskrit, Om Mani Padme Hum, and Tibetan prayer wheels creates an extremely weird effect unlikely to arouse the interest of the young Chinese. This is the surface struggle between conservatism and radicalism in China. Its outcome will depend largely upon Japanese and European politics, for no mere argument will settle the question. China may yet be driven to communism if the champions of conservatism cannot prove themselves worthy to find a way out for China. As regards the true temperament of the Chinese race and the large mass of people who either read Chinese only or read nothing at all, conservatism will always remain. Most important, however, is the fact that Chinese do not want to change. Behind all the outward changes of custom and women's dress and habits of locomotion, the Chinese retains a sneering smile for the hot-headed young man who wears a foreign coat or who speaks English too well. That young man always looks immature and is often shamed out of his progressiveness. The strange thing is that the man who no longer looks immature veers toward conservatism in China. The returned student arrives at maturity by putting on a Chinese gown and accepting the Chinese way of life. He loves its mellowness, its leisure, its comforts, and its commonplace contentment. In his Chinese gown, his soul has come to rest. The strange fascination of Chinese surroundings, which keeps many queer Europeans in China for life, also comes over him toward middle age. Meanwhile, the large majority of the people will keep in their old ruts, not by any conscious conviction, but by a kind of racial instinct. I feel the racial tradition is so strong that its fundamental pattern of life will always remain, even if a cataclysmic upheaval like a communistic regime should come. The old tradition of individuality, toleration, moderation, and common sense will break communism and change it beyond recognition, rather than communism with its socialistic, impersonal, and rigoristic outlook break the old tradition. It must be so.